The day they came to hang Maria Bell, the sky over Dusty Creek, Texas was the color of an old wound, red and angry and unforgiving. The kind of sky that made a person feel small against the weight of the world pressing down on them. She stood on the front porch of the only home she had ever known, 31 years old, her dark hair twisted back beneath a sun-bleached bonnet, her hands clasped in front of her so they would not shake. The two deputies who came for her were men she had known most of her life: Hector Gaines, who used to steal peaches from her mother's tree when they were children, and young Cal Briggs, barely old enough to shave, who had the good grace to look ashamed of himself. Behind them, riding a black horse that seemed too fine for the dust of Dusty Creek, was Sheriff Roy Alcott, a wide and weathered man with a jaw like a cliff face and eyes that held all the warmth of a dry riverbed. "Maria Bell," Alcott said, drawing out her name like he was reading it off a wanted poster. "You are hereby summoned to appear before Judge Harold Crane on the matter of the criminal sentence owed by the late Thomas Bell, your husband, God rest him." Maria did not flinch. She had been expecting this, or something like it, ever since Thomas had been shot 3 weeks ago trying to hold up the territorial mail coach just outside of Laredo. Thomas Bell, her husband of 6 years, a man she had loved with every piece of her heart even when he was foolish, even when he spent their savings on cards, even when he borrowed money from men whose names she was not supposed to know. Thomas had always been too warm and too reckless and too certain that tomorrow would fix what today had broken. And then one day there was no tomorrow left for Thomas Bell, and Maria had buried him in the red earth behind the house with her own hands and wept until she was hollow. She had thought in her grief that his death would at least close the door on his debts and his crimes. She had not counted on Judge Harold Crane. "Judge Crane has signed an order," Alcott continued, and he pulled a folded paper from his breast pocket and held it out like it was something clean. "Under the provisions of Crane's own ruling in the matter of communal liability, since Thomas Bell died before serving his sentence of 18 months' labor at the Crane County Road Camp, said sentence passes to the nearest surviving kin capable of labor, that being you, Mrs. Bell." "That is not the law," Maria said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. "It is Crane's law," Alcott said, "and in Crane County that is the only law that matters." She looked at the paper. She looked at Hector Gaines, who would not meet her eyes. She looked at the dried flowers she had hung above the porch door the summer before, when Thomas had gone 3 whole months without gambling, and she had believed, truly believed, that they were turning a corner together. Then she stepped off the porch and walked toward the deputy's wagon without being asked, because Maria Bell had always understood that dignity was the one thing that could not be taken from a person unless they allowed it. The courthouse in Dusty Creek was a squat stone building that smelled of pine resin and old tobacco, and Judge Harold Crane held court in a room that was far too large for the justice it dispensed. He was a man of 60, with white side whiskers that made him look like he was wearing the wings of some pale bird, and his eyes were the flat gray of a man who had decided long ago that he was always right and had seen no reason to revisit that conclusion. He read the order himself, aloud, in front of everyone who had crowded into the gallery, ranchers and shopkeepers and ladies from the church auxiliary and old men who came to watch proceedings, because it was something to do. Maria sat at the single wooden table that served as the defendant's position and listened to her own sentencing with the particular focus of someone who is quietly making a plan. When Crane finished, he looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. "Do you understand the terms, Mrs. Bell?" "I understand them," Maria said. "I do not accept them." A murmur rolled through the gallery. Crane's eyebrows rose about 1/4 of an inch, which for him was an expression of considerable surprise. "Beg pardon," he said. "I wish to appeal," Maria said, and she rose to her feet, smoothing her black mourning skirt with both hands. "I wish to appeal this order on the grounds that it is not founded in any territorial law, state law, or federal law that I am aware of, that it was written by your own hand to benefit your own road camp operation, and that the inheritance of criminal punishment is a concept so contrary to basic justice that even this court in this county should be ashamed to enforce it. The silence in the courthouse was so complete that Maria could hear the flies buzzing against the window panes. Crane set his spectacles down on the bench very slowly. "Mrs. Bell," he said, in the voice of a man explaining something to someone he believed to be simple, "you have no legal representation. You have no standing to appeal, and you have no choice in this matter." "I have 30 days," Maria said. "I have read the territorial code, Judge Crane. Any citizen charged under any order of this court, even one of your own invention, has 30 days to present a written appeal before sentencing is carried out. I am invoking that right." She had, in fact, spent the 3 days between Thomas's death and the deputy's arrival reading every piece of legal text she could lay her hands on, which amounted to 2 territorial law pamphlets, a copy of the Texas State Constitution, and several back issues of the Crane County Register that had printed summaries of notable court decisions. She was not a lawyer, but she was a woman who had spent 6 years managing the practical chaos of Thomas Bell's life, which had given her considerable practice in finding the rules that people in power preferred to forget. Crane stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Sheriff Alcott. "Give her 30 days, he said, and his voice was like a stone dropped into still water, spreading out in cold rings. "She'll find no lawyer in this county to take her case, no lawyer in this territory. And when her 30 days are done, she will serve her sentence." He thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong. Maria walked out of that courthouse with her head high and her hands steady at her sides, and she kept walking until she was 2 blocks away and around the corner of the Feed Merchants building, and then she leaned against the warm adobe wall and let herself shake for exactly 1 minute. She counted it out. 1 minute for fear, and then she would have to start figuring out what came next. What came next began with a name. Old Bessie Cartwright, who ran the boarding house on the east side of Dusty Creek, and who had known Maria since she was a girl, had told her once, in passing, about a lawyer who had taken on a case against the Crane family mining interest 2 years prior and had won. Not won completely. Nothing was ever completely won against Crane County's ruling class, but had won enough to make the family back down, which amounted to the same thing. His name was Nathan Sheridan, and he had an office in the town of Red Hollow, which was a 2-day ride northeast through some of the driest country in that part of Texas. Maria had $12.40 in the tin box she kept beneath the floorboard of the kitchen. She had a horse named Juniper, a plain brown mare with a steady temperament and 1 white sock. She had her late mother's saddle and a bedroll that had seen better decades, and she had 29 days left. She was on the road before sunrise. The country between Dusty Creek and Red Hollow was the kind of landscape that did not forgive carelessness. The land rolled out in great pale waves of grass and caliche, punctuated by mesquite and prickly pear, and the occasional lonely stand of live oak that looked as though it had survived everything the world had thrown at it by sheer stubbornness. The sky was enormous, the color of bleached denim by day and ink by night, and Maria rode through it with the methodical steadiness of a woman who had decided she would not be stopped. She camped the first night in the shelter of a rocky outcropping, eating cold cornbread she had wrapped in cloth and listening to the coyotes making their strange music at the edges of the dark. She thought about Thomas, the way she always did at night. She thought about the last morning she had seen him alive, when he had kissed her cheek before first light and told her he would be back in a week. He had smiled the way he always smiled, with his whole face, like the sun coming out from behind a cloud, and she had believed him because she always believed Thomas even when she knew better. She thought about Crane and his gray eyes and his certainty, and she felt the clean sharp edge of her anger like a blade she was keeping honed. She arrived in Red Hollow on the afternoon of the second day, rode dusty and stiff from the saddle, and she asked the first person she saw, a boy sweeping the porch of the general store, where she could find Nathan Sheridan's law office. The boy pointed her to a narrow building wedged between the Red Hollow Hotel and a harness shop. The sign above the door read in careful black letters, N. Sheridan, Attorney A.T. Law, established 1878. It was 1882, which meant the man had been in business 4 years. Maria tied Juniper to the hitching post, took a moment to straighten her bonnet and brush the worst of the dust from her skirt, and then pushed open the door. The office was small and deeply book-lined. Every available surface was covered with stacks of papers and legal volumes and the occasional coffee cup that had been set down and forgotten. It smelled of ink and leather and the warm dust of too many books in a small space, and it should have felt cluttered, but somehow it felt occupied. The way a room feels when someone genuinely lives and works in it rather than merely performing work for show. Nathan Sheridan was standing at the far wall with his back to her, running his finger along a shelf of volumes and muttering something to himself. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 33 or 34, tall and lean in the way of men who forget to eat when they are busy, wearing a dark vest over a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. His hair was a deep brown with a slight wave to it, and it needed a cut about 2 weeks ago. When he turned at the sound of the door, she saw a face that was interesting rather than handsome, strong jaw, sharp dark eyes, a mouth that looked like it could go either way between a grin and a grimace, and had probably spent equal time at both. "I am closed for the day," he said, though it was clearly still mid-afternoon. "I am aware that you may have preferred not to be disturbed," Maria said, "but I have ridden 2 days to see you, and I have 29 days in which to prevent myself from being sent to a labor camp in place of my dead husband, so I am hoping you will make an exception." He blinked. Then he set down the book he had been holding and said, "Close the door and sit down." She did. He pulled up his own chair and sat across from her with a legal pad on his knee and a pencil in his hand, and Maria Bell told Nathan Sheridan everything. She told it well. She was not a woman who was given to excess of emotion in her speech. Thomas had always been the one who could make a room feel things, but she had clarity and precision and a memory that retained details with the accuracy of a courthouse ledger. She told him about Thomas, about the marriage, about his death, about the deputies who came to the door, about the order Crane had written and read aloud in his own courthouse. She told him about the appeal she had invoked and the 30-day window. She told him about the $12.40. When she finished, Nathan Sheridan had covered 3 pages of his legal pad with notes, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not quite categorize. "Crane's communal liability ruling," he said. "I know it. He invented it 2 years ago to force a widow named Clara Hutchins to work off her husband's debt to his lumber operation. She did not appeal. She served 9 months before consumption took her." Maria felt the cold of that settle into her chest. "I took a case against one of his rulings before," Nathan said. "Mining interest, mineral rights dispute. We won a partial settlement. He has not forgiven me for it, and I have not been able to set foot in Crane County since without feeling watched." "Then you know what he is," Maria said. "I know exactly what he is." He looked at his notes. "What he has done with this ruling is legally indefensible if we can get it in front of the right judge. The problem is that in Crane County there is no right judge, there is only Crane. We would need to petition the 10th District Court in San Antonio for an emergency review, on the grounds that Crane's ruling constitutes an unconstitutional deprivation of liberty without due process, and that it violates the fundamental principle that criminal sentences are personal and non-transferable." "Can you do that?" Maria asked. "The paperwork, yes. The travel to San Antonio, the filing, the fee, that is where it becomes more complicated." He looked at her steadily. "The filing fee alone is $8. I have $12.40. I charge $15 for a case of this complexity, usually." They looked at each other across the small, cluttered office in the long, golden light of the Texas afternoon. "I could pay the remainder when I have it," Maria said. Once the case is resolved and I am not being sent to a labor camp." He held her gaze for a moment, and then one side of his mouth moved in that direction that was either a grin or a grimace. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "I have wanted a solid challenge to Crane's communal liability ruling since the day Clara Hutchins died. I will take this case. We will settle the matter of fees when you are free and clear, and not a moment before." Something loosened in Maria's chest that had been wound tight for 3 weeks. She did not cry. She had cried all she planned to cry in the period immediately following Thomas's death, but she felt the release of it like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Nathan said, already turning back to his legal pad. "We have an enormous amount of work to do and very little time in which to do it." The next 3 days were the most intensely productive of Maria's life. Nathan Sheridan did not work slowly. He drafted the petition for emergency review with the focused speed of someone who had clearly thought about this particular argument before, and he drew on Maria's precise memory to fill in every detail of Crane's original order. He found 2 precedent cases from neighboring districts that supported the non-transferability of criminal punishment. He wrote a letter to a colleague in San Antonio named Judge Elias Morrow, whom he described only as someone who hated injustice more than he hated inconvenience, which Maria gathered was considerable praise. Maria worked alongside him. She copied documents in her careful, even hand when his cramped working script became illegible from speed. She organized the case files with the methodical efficiency she had developed over years of managing Thomas's chaotic household papers. She made coffee when it was needed, which was often, and she argued with him when she believed he was wrong, which also happened more than once. On the second evening, they argued for 45 minutes about whether to frame the petition primarily as a constitutional challenge or primarily as a factual challenge to Crane's invented doctrine. Nathan believed the constitutional argument was stronger in isolation. Maria believed they needed both angles, that a judge reviewing this in San Antonio would want to feel he had multiple grounds to rule in their favor so that no single argument could be picked apart. Nathan had listened to her with the expression of a man who was waiting for the gap in her reasoning, and when the gap did not materialize, his expression shifted into something that looked a great deal like genuine respect. "You would have made a formidable lawyer," he said. "I would have made a formidable anything if I had been given the opportunity," Maria said, and there was no bitterness in it, only the plain statement of fact. "Fair," he said, and he turned back to his papers and began integrating her structural suggestion into the petition. On the 3rd evening, Nathan rode with her to the telegraph office and sent the letter to his colleague in San Antonio, and then they stood outside in the cooling air of the Red Hollow Main Street while the last of the daylight turned the dust pink, and the horses moved gently at the hitching posts. And Nathan said, "You should stay in Red Hollow while I travel to San Antonio. I will need someone to be present in Dusty Creek when Crane's people come looking, someone who can legally attest that the appeal process is active." "I will not hide," Maria said. "I am not suggesting hiding. I am suggesting a strategic position." He turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were very dark and very direct. "If you return to Dusty Creek before I have the district court's acknowledgement of our petition, Crane can argue that you abandon your appeal and proceed with the sentencing." Maria thought about this. She thought about Juniper in the livery stable and the $12.40 and Bessie Cartwright's boarding house back in Dusty Creek. "I cannot afford to stay in Red Hollow for however long this takes," she said. "My client room," Nathan said, "at the back of the office. It has a cot and a window, and I use it when I am working too late to walk home, which is most nights. You are welcome to it." She looked at him with the straightforward measuring look she gave everything she needed to evaluate. He met it without blinking, without anything in his expression that was not simple practical honesty. "That is very generous," she said. "It is practical," he said. "I need you close at hand to answer questions as I prepare. And I will not leave a client without shelter when it is within my power to provide it." She accepted, because she needed to and because she could see it for what it was. And the following morning Nathan Sheridan loaded his legal saddlebags and his one good court coat and rode south toward San Antonio, leaving Maria Bell in possession of his office with instructions about where the spare key was and which of the neighboring business people she could trust. The days that followed were strange and quiet in a way that Maria had not expected. She kept the office, organized Nathan's remaining papers with a thoroughness that she suspected would alarm him when he returned, and continued reading through his legal library with the appetite of someone who had always been hungry for exactly this kind of knowledge and had never had access to it. The territorial law was dense but not impenetrable, and the more she read, the angrier she became, not the hot, panicked anger of crisis, but the slow, deep anger of someone who can see clearly just how the system has been arranged to trap people like her, and who is determined to understand every one of the mechanisms before she is done. She also talked to the people of Red Hollow, which she had not planned but which happened naturally, the way things happen in small towns. The woman who ran the hotel next door was named Dolores Vega, a compact and opinionated woman of 50 whose family had ranched this country since before Texas was Texas, and who had a great deal to say about Judge Crane and his various depredations. The harness maker on the other side, a quiet man named Mr. Pemberton, had twice seen men from Crane County come to Red Hollow asking questions about Nathan Sheridan, which he considered worth mentioning. On the 6th day, a man came to the office whom Maria did not recognize. He was thickset and wore a Crane County deputy's badge, and he asked, very politely, whether Nathan Sheridan was available. "Mr. Sheridan is away on legal business," Maria said, from behind the desk where she had seated herself with what she hoped was sufficient authority. "And you are?" the deputy asked. "Maria Bell," she said, watching his face with great attention. "Mr. Sheridan's client. Is there something I can help you with, deputy?" The deputy's face did some complicated things very quickly. He clearly had not expected to find her here rather than in Dusty Creek. He had clearly been sent to assess the situation. He said, in a carefully neutral tone, that he was just passing through, and he left, and Maria waited until she could no longer hear his horse before she allowed herself to feel the cold current of anxiety that had moved through her during the entire conversation. She wrote a letter to Nathan in San Antonio that evening, giving him the details of the visit, and she sent it with the morning stage. Nathan's reply arrived 4 days later, folded into a single page in a handwriting considerably more legible than his working script, which she took to mean he had written it carefully. He had filed the petition. Judge Elias Morrow had received it and was expediting a review given the time constraint. Nathan expected a preliminary ruling within the week, and if it went as he anticipated, he would return to Red Hollow with a stay of execution on Crane's sentence order pending the full district court review. He had also written, in the final paragraph, something that surprised her. He had written, "I find, when I try to organize my arguments here in San Antonio, that I keep returning to the way you structured your analysis of the constitutional and factual angles. You were right about both approaches needing to be present." Judge Morrow said, when I presented it, that it was the most thoroughly grounded petition he had read from this part of Texas in 3 years. "I thought you should know that, since it is substantially your work as much as mine." Maria read that paragraph twice. Then she set the letter down on the desk and looked out the window at the ordinary street of Red Hollow going about its ordinary business, and she felt something shift in the landscape of herself that she had not expected to feel. She had been a married woman, and then a grieving woman, and then a woman in legal peril, moving through each stage with the focused momentum of necessity. She had not had occasion to think about herself as someone separate from those circumstances, but Nathan Sheridan's letter, with its straightforward acknowledgement that she had contributed something valuable, with its quiet honesty about crediting the work to its source, made her suddenly, briefly, acutely aware of being a person in her own right. She thought about that for a while. Then she made a pot of coffee and went back to his legal library, because there was still a great deal she wanted to read. Nathan returned to Red Hollow on a Tuesday, 14 days after he had left, riding into the main street in the late morning with his horse tired and his court coat dusty, but something in his bearing that Maria, watching from the office window, recognized immediately as victory, the particular quality of a person who has won a thing they believed in. She had the door open before he reached the hitching post. "We have a stay," he said, swinging down from the saddle and pulling a folded document from his breast pocket with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something valuable. "Signed by Judge Elias Morrow of the 10th District Court of Texas, San Antonio. Judge Crane is hereby ordered to suspend all enforcement actions against Maria Bell pending the district court's full review of his communal liability ruling. The review is scheduled for 30 days from today." Maria took the document from him. She read it carefully, which he let her do without interruption, and when she had read it twice, she folded it again along its original lines and held it in both hands. "This means he cannot touch me for 30 days, she said. "It means he cannot legally touch you," Nathan said, with the precision of a lawyer. Which in a territory that still runs largely on Crane's law is not a perfect guarantee, but it is considerably better than what you had 3 weeks ago. What happens in 30 days when the district court reviews it? Morrow has already indicated his preliminary read of the case. Crane's communal liability ruling will not survive federal constitutional scrutiny. Morrow will strike it down. And when he does, not only is your sentence void, but every other case Crane has prosecuted under that ruling will be reopened. Nathan looked at her steadily. Clara Hutchins did not have family to pursue restitution, but there are others. Maria felt the weight of that. "You are going after him," she said. "I have been going after him for 2 years, Nathan said. "This is the case that makes it possible." They stood in the morning sunlight on the main street of Red Hollow, with a legal document between them that was the closest thing to freedom Maria had held in 3 weeks, and she looked at Nathan Sheridan and thought about the letter he had written from San Antonio, and the way he had heard her arguments in the office, and the evenings they had spent working side by side in the cramped space that smelled of ink and coffee. She thought about Thomas. She thought about his warmth and his recklessness, and the 6 years of her life she had given to loving him wholly, and the hollow grief that had followed his death. She thought that grief did not vanish because the crisis did, and she was not prepared to examine whatever was happening in her chest when she looked at Nathan Sheridan with the precision she usually reserved for legal texts. "Are you hungry?" she asked, because it was the most practical thing she could offer. "Completely," he said, and the grin or grimace resolved finally into a full and unguarded grin, and something in Maria's chest made a small, irretrievable decision of its own. They ate at Dollar's Vegas Hotel dining room, roasted chicken and pan-fried potatoes, and the excellent sourdough bread that Dollar's made every morning, and Nathan told her about San Antonio and the district court, and the 5 other lawyers he had spoken with who were interested in supporting the constitutional challenge. Maria told him about the deputy who had come asking questions, and the letters she had written, and the sections of territorial law she had worked through in his library. He listened to the legal portions with the focused attention he gave everything, and asked 3 specific questions that made her realize she had spotted a secondary angle on the challenge to Crane's ruling that he had not yet incorporated. "Write that down when we get back," he said immediately, pointing at her with his fork. "That argument about the labor camp operation constituting a financial benefit to Crane personally. If we can document the revenue stream from that camp, we can attach a corruption angle that makes the constitutional challenge almost secondary." "I will need access to the camp's financial records," Maria said. "Which we will not get easily, but there are ways to compel disclosure in a district court proceeding." He was already thinking, she could see it in his eyes, the way they shifted slightly inward as he followed a thread of argument. "How much do you know about the camp's operation?" More than Crane knows I know, Maria said. Thomas talked. He always talked too much, but I listened to everything. I know which contractors supply the camp. I know the road construction contracts that Crane awards through his court orders, and I know that at least 2 of those contractors are relatives of his. Nathan set down his fork entirely. You have not mentioned this before. You have been in San Antonio, Maria said. I have had to save some things for your return. He looked at her across the chicken and potatoes with an expression that she had begun to recognize as the one he wore when something exceeded his expectations, and she found she liked being the thing that exceeded his expectations considerably more than she would have anticipated. They returned to the office and worked until past midnight, the lamp burning low on the desk between them, building the corruption argument layer by layer from Maria's knowledge of Thomas's conversations and Nathan's understanding of the legal mechanisms for financial disclosure in district court proceedings. Maria wrote notes in her careful hand while Nathan dictated and argued, and occasionally stopped mid-sentence to go to a different shelf for a different book. At some point after 11, she looked up from the page she was writing to find him looking at her rather than at his notes, and the expression on his face was not the professional assessment she had grown accustomed to. It was something quieter and more personal, and it was gone almost immediately as he glanced back down at his work, but she had seen it. She did not say anything, but she thought about it as she wrote. In the 3 weeks that followed the 30 days of the district court review period, the situation became considerably more complex before it improved. Judge Crane, informed of the stay of execution on his order, was not pleased. He could not move against Maria directly, but he could and did send Sheriff Alcott to Dusty Creek with orders to inventory and assess the Bell property for outstanding debts, which was a mechanism he had used before to pressure people without directly defying a court order. Maria learned of this from a letter sent by Bessie Cartwright, and she and Nathan spent an afternoon working through the legal options. He cannot seize the property without a separate proceeding, Nathan said, and he cannot file that proceeding in his own court while there is an active district court review touching on his authority. He knows that. He is doing this to frighten you into withdrawing the appeal. He chose the wrong woman for that strategy, Maria said. He very obviously did, Nathan said, and he said it with the particular warmth she had come to associate with the moments when he forgot to maintain the professional distance he kept by habit. She wrote to Bessie Cartwright with specific instructions. She told Bessie to make sure the neighbors knew the property was legally protected pending the district court proceedings, and she gave Nathan's address in Red Hollow as the point of contact for any legal queries. Bessie, who had grown up with a fierce respect for the law and a fierce contempt for the people who bent it, executed this with considerable enthusiasm. On the 16th day of the review period, a rider came from San Antonio with a preliminary notice that the district court had found substantial merit in the constitutional challenge and was requesting a formal hearing in 30 additional days. This was both good news and a complication. It extended the timeline, which was a relief in terms of immediate pressure, but it also meant the case would not be resolved quickly, and Maria's $12.40 were long since consumed by livery fees and the incidental expenses of life. She brought this up directly, in the way she brought up everything. I need to be honest with you about my financial situation, she said, sitting across from Nathan in the office on a warm evening when the windows were open to let in what little breeze there was. I know your financial situation, he said. I have known it since you walked in the door. I cannot pay you $15 or anything close to it in any near-term timeline. Mrs. Bell, he said, and then he paused and something in his face shifted slightly. Maria, I told you we would settle fees when you are free and clear. I meant that. I am not running a debt ledger against you. I am aware of what you told me, she said. I am telling you that the matter may take considerably longer than either of us planned, and I will not have you carrying this case without compensation while I do nothing." He looked at her steadily. "What are you proposing?" "I can keep your office," she said. "I have been doing so, and I can see that it needed it badly before I arrived. I can copy and organize your correspondence and case files, which will save you considerable time. I know the law well enough by now to do a first review of any new client matter, which you can use as you see fit. I am proposing that I work here in this office for as long as the case takes, and that we consider that an appropriate exchange." There was a long silence, in which Nathan appeared to be evaluating this proposal with the same analytical rigor he applied to legal arguments. "That is a fair exchange," he said finally. "More than fair, in fact. You have already improved the organization of this office to a degree I find somewhat humbling." "Your filing system was catastrophic," Maria said. "It was my system," he said with dignity. "It was a catastrophe with aspirations toward a system," she said, and he laughed a full, genuine laugh, the kind that a person cannot manufacture and does not bother to restrain, and Maria Bell laughed with him, and it was the first time she had laughed properly since Thomas died. The laughter faded naturally and left a different quality of quiet in its wake. They were sitting very close together in the lamplight, close enough that she could see the tiredness in his face, and the way his dark eyes held some complicated calculation that was not legal argument. "How long were you married?" he asked, which was a different kind of question from any he had asked before. 6 years, she said. "From 1876. I was 25 when we married. Thomas was 28. She paused. "He was a good man in many of the ways that matter. He was not a reliable man, which is a different thing. I loved him anyway." "I am sorry you lost him," Nathan said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it without qualification. "Thank you," she said. "And you?" "No wife." "No family in Red Hollow?" "No," he said. "I came to Red Hollow 4 years ago because it was as far as I could get from a life in Austin that had stopped fitting, and I have been here working since. Family is my mother in Dallas and 2 sisters who are both married and considerably more sensible than I am." He said the last part with a lightness that did not quite cover something more serious, and she did not press it, because she understood better than most the difference between what a person was willing to say and what they were still working out how to carry. "Austin stopped fitting," she said. "What does that mean?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was very nearly engaged to a woman there," he said. "A judge's daughter. Very proper, very appropriate by every measure that the people around us were measuring. And I realized, about a month before the arrangement was to become formal, that I was going to be deeply unhappy in that life. Not because of her specifically, she was a perfectly fine person, but because the version of myself that fit into that life was not the version I could actually live in." He paused. She was relieved too, I think, though she was too well-bred to say so. Maria considered this. "So you came to Red Hollow and took on Crane County instead?" "It seemed like a reasonable trade," he said, and the grin or grimace appeared and resolved into something softer than either. She went to bed that night on the cot in the client room, listening to the sounds of Red Hollow settling into the dark, and she thought about Nathan Sheridan with an honesty she had not yet allowed herself. She thought about the way he listened, not the polite listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the real listening of someone who was genuinely tracking what she said and letting it affect his thinking. She thought about his laugh and the Austin judge's daughter, and the fact that he had called her Maria for the first time without asking permission, in a tone of voice that suggested he had been wanting to for some time. She thought about grief and the ways it changed shape without disappearing, becoming something you carried rather than something that carried you. She thought these were the thoughts of a woman who was not yet ready to act on any of them, and probably should not be, and that acknowledging them clearly and honestly to herself was nevertheless the more dignified approach. She slept well for the first time in weeks. The formal district court hearing took place in San Antonio on the 44th day, after Nathan had first filed the petition. Maria and Nathan rode the stage together from Red Hollow to San Antonio, which was a journey of 2.5 days, and the enforced proximity of the stage coach with two other passengers, a cattle buyer named Morrison and an older woman named Mrs. Hartley, who slept most of the way, gave them a contained world in which to continue the work and the conversation in equal measure. They talked through the case during the daylight hours, and when the work was done and Mrs. Hartley was asleep and the cattle buyer was staring out at the darkening plains, they talked about other things. Maria told him about her childhood, about her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had kept a kitchen garden with an ambition that exceeded the Texas climate's cooperation. She told him about being the eldest of 3 girls and learning to read law from her father's books, which had made her a strange child among her schoolmates, but had given her a foundation she was now deeply grateful for. He told her about law school in Austin and the cases he had worked on for the firm there, and about the morning he had woken up and known with certainty that the life he was building was the wrong one, with the particular clarity that comes sometimes before dawn. "Were you frightened?" she asked. "When you left?" "Enormously," he said, "but less frightened than I would have been if I had stayed." She understood that completely, and she told him so. San Antonio was a city of a scale that Dusty Creek was not. Wide streets, substantial buildings, the sound of Spanish and English and German mixing in the market air, the river winding through the center of it all. They stayed at a respectable hotel, separate rooms, adjacent, which was the only appropriate arrangement, and Nathan spent the evening before the hearing reviewing his final arguments, while Maria reviewed the financial documentation she had helped compile. She had become, over the 6 weeks they had been working together, genuinely indispensable to this case, and she knew it and he knew it, and neither of them had made a point of saying so because it was simply true and did not need the weight of acknowledgement. The district courthouse in San Antonio was an imposing building of pale stone, and Judge Elias Morrow was an imposing man of 62 who wore his judicial authority with the ease of someone who had had it long enough to forget it was remarkable. He had a long face and thick white hair, and a way of looking at legal arguments that reminded Maria of the way her father had looked at difficult mathematics problems, with pleasure rather than apprehension. Nathan presented the case with the organized force of someone who had been preparing this argument for 2 years and sharpening it for 6 weeks. He laid out the constitutional basis first, then the factual impossibility of transferring criminal punishment, then, and this was the part he saved, the financial documentation showing Crane's road camp operation, the contractor relationships, the revenue flowing from his own court orders to his own family connections. Judge Morrow asked 7 questions during the presentation. 4 of them were questions Maria had anticipated, and for which she had prepared Nathan's responses during the stage ride. 2 were new, and Nathan handled them with the facility of someone who knew his case at the level of architecture rather than just surface. One of them, about the precedent from the neighboring district, was a question Maria had flagged in her review of the case files as the weakest point in the foundation, and Nathan's response was a reframing she had helped construct specifically for this possibility, and watching it land in Morrow's expression was, Maria thought, one of the more satisfying experiences of her adult life. Crane had sent a lawyer to represent his position. He was a polished man from Austin, who made the constitutional argument with the confidence of someone who had never seriously expected to lose a case in Crane County and had not yet recalibrated for a different jurisdiction. He argued for 40 minutes. Morrow asked him 2 questions, both of which he answered less well than he should have. The hearing recessed for lunch. Nathan and Maria sat in a small restaurant 2 blocks from the courthouse and ate without saying very much, which was its own kind of communication, the comfortable quiet of people who had been in close enough company long enough to have words for only the things that needed them. "He is going to rule for us," Maria said. "Yes," Nathan said. "The question is how broadly." As broadly as he can, Maria said. He is the kind of man who, when he sees a rotten beam in a structure, wants to know if the whole wall needs to come down. Nathan looked at her across the table with that expression, the one he wore when something exceeded his expectations, and it had a warmth to it now that it had not had in those first days in the office when it had been purely professional. "You are remarkably good at reading people," he said. "I was married to a man who ran primarily on charm," Maria said. "It develops the skill." He laughed again. "Easier now. The way laughter becomes easier between people who have been sharing space and pressure and cold coffee for 6 weeks." Judge Elias Morrow issued his ruling that afternoon, 4 pages of dense but precise legal language that Maria read over Nathan's shoulder as he held the document, both of them standing in the courthouse corridor, because they had not wanted to wait until they were somewhere more appropriate. The ruling struck down Crane's communal liability doctrine in its entirety. It found the doctrine unconstitutional, without legal basis in any Texas or federal statute, and deliberately designed to benefit the financial interests of the judge who had created it. It voided every sentencing order issued under the doctrine. It ordered the district attorney's office to open a formal investigation into Judge Harold Crane's road camp operation and his financial relationships with the contractors it employed. And it specifically named Maria Bell's case as the lead matter that had brought the doctrine before the district court, in language that made clear the court considered her appeal legitimate and her grievance real. Maria read the last page twice. Then she stood in the corridor of the San Antonio courthouse with the ruling in her hands and thought about Clara Hutchins, who had not appealed and had served 9 months and had died of consumption, and about the 2 deputies who had come to her porch with a folded paper and a certainty that she would not fight, and about Thomas and his gambling and his warmth, and the way she had loved him in full knowledge of his flaws, because love is not contingent on perfection, only on truth. And about the 31-year-old woman who had ridden 2 days through dry Texas country on a steady brown mare with $12.40, and a fury that had refused to become despair. She was not going to cry because she had decided that already, but her hands were shaking. Nathan noticed. He put his hand over hers just briefly, just the warmth of his hand covering both of hers around the edges of the document, and said nothing, and that said more than any specific words would have. They returned to Red Hollow on the stage, this time without the cattle buyer or the sleeping Mrs. Hartley, and the 2.5 days of the return journey were different from the outward trip in the way that post-victory is always different from pre-battle. The case was not entirely finished. Crane would undoubtedly resist the investigation, and the investigation itself would take months, but the immediate crisis was over, and in the absence of the crisis, there was space for a different kind of awareness. They talked for long stretches, and were quiet for long stretches, and watched the Texas landscape move past the stage windows in the long golden light of late afternoon, and Maria was acutely conscious of how natural the silence was between them, the way it required no management or filling, the way it felt like companionable warmth rather than absence. On the second evening, when they had stopped for the night at a stage station and were sitting outside in the cooling air while the driver watered the horses, Nathan said, "What will you do now, when the case is fully closed?" Maria had thought about this. She had not expected to have to think about it, since the case had consumed all available mental space for nearly 2 months, but she had found it creeping in at the edges lately. "Return to Dusty Creek," she said. "The property is mine. I need to decide whether to work it or sell it. It is a long ride," he said, "from Red Hollow." "It is," she agreed. She was looking at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, and she was very carefully not looking at him, and she was aware that she was being careful, which was itself a kind of information. "You have been of considerable service to this office," he said, in a tone that was aiming for professional and not quite arriving there. "The filing system alone represents a substantial improvement." A catastrophic system made orderly, she said. Yes. A pause. I expect it would fall back into catastrophe within a week of your departure. She let the silence hold for a moment. Then she turned to look at him, because she was not a woman who avoided things that needed to be looked at directly. His face in the fading light was tired and honest and trying somewhat unsuccessfully to be neutral, and she found she was done letting him work that hard at it. Nathan, she said, are you asking me to stay? He looked at her with the directness she had learned to trust. I am very poorly attempting to ask you that, yes, he said. Though I am aware that it is too soon and that you are still in a period of grief, and that I have no right to, you are not poorly attempting anything, Maria said. You have been direct and honest about everything in this entire proceeding, and I would ask you to continue in that direction now. He was quiet for a moment that had real weight to it. Then he said, I would like very much for you to stay in Red Hollow. I would like to continue working with you, because you are genuinely excellent at this work, and because I would be a fool to lose that. And I would like, in some future that I understand is not now, to find out whether what I think is happening between us is actually happening, or whether it is the particular intimacy of shared crisis that resembles something real but doesn't outlast the crisis. Maria thought about this carefully. She thought about Thomas and about grief and about the woman she had been in that marriage versus the woman who had ridden 2 days through dry country and walked into a courthouse and appealed her own sentencing, and she thought that these were not different women but rather the same woman at different points of understanding herself. It is not only the crisis, she said, but you are right that it is not time yet. I need time. Yes, he said, but I will stay, she said, in Red Hollow for a while longer. The expression on his face in the last of the daylight was the most unguarded she had seen it, and it was something she thought she would remember for a considerable time. The weeks that followed were a different kind of life than any Maria had lived before. She worked in Nathan's office formally now, which they had made the arrangement explicit and fair. She managed his correspondence and client intake and the organizational system she had built, and he paid her a regular wage that was modest but real, and she found herself a room in Dollar's Vegas hotel that was small but private and had a window that faced east, which meant she woke every morning to whatever the Texas sky was doing, and it was rarely the same thing twice. She also wrote letters. She wrote to Bessie Cartwright in Dusty Creek, and to her sister Clara, who was living in Waco with her husband and 3 children. She wrote to the district attorney's office in San Antonio supporting the investigation into Crane's camp operation, providing every detail of what Thomas had told her that she could recall. She found in the process of writing these letters that the grief for Thomas had changed its texture. It was still present, it was still true, but it had stopped being the defining fact of each day and had become instead something she carried alongside everything else, the way people carry the losses that have shaped them without being paralyzed by them. She and Nathan took to walking in the evenings after the office closed, which had begun practically discussing case matters, and had become something else, though they continued to discuss case matters because they were both people who thought through talking and had a great deal to think about. They walked the main street and the side streets and the path along the shallow creek at the edge of town, and they talked about law and justice, and the particular injustices of Crane County and books they had read and their families, and what they believed about the world. 3 months after the San Antonio ruling, Judge Harold Crane was suspended from his position, pending the conclusion of the district attorney's investigation. The suspension was based on the financial evidence compiled in part from Maria's documentation, and Nathan received the official notice on a Thursday afternoon and came to find her in the back of the office where she was reviewing a new client's land dispute materials, and he set the notice on the desk in front of her without saying anything, and she read it and then looked up at him. "Clara Hutchins," she said. "Yes," he said. "This is for her too." She stood up from the desk, and he was very close, and the professional careful distance that they had maintained out of respect for time and grief, and the process of knowing each other had been slowly, incrementally closing over 3 months. And now it was simply gone, and she put her hand against his jaw the way she would have put her hand against something she needed to feel was real, and he put his hand over hers. And they stood like that for a moment that was more honest than most moments Maria had experienced in her life. "It has been long enough," she said, "that I can tell the difference between crisis and what comes after it." "And," he said. "And you know what I am going to say," she said, "because you have been reading me as accurately as I have been reading you for 3 months." He smiled, the full, unguarded smile she had seen before, the one that had nothing of the grin or grimace in it, and he said, "I would still like to hear it." "I love you," she said, with the directness that was the only mode she had ever been comfortable in. "I love you, Nathan." Which is a thing I did not expect to be able to say again for a very long time, and here I am saying it in your law office 3 months after you saved my life. "You saved your own life," he said. "I was there for the legal paperwork." "Do not minimize your contribution," she said, and he laughed and she laughed, and then he kissed her, which was warm and unhurried and entirely honest, and it felt like something that had been traveling toward this point since she had walked through his door covered in road dust and invoked her right of appeal. The investigation into Judge Harold Crane concluded the following spring, a full 8 months after Maria had first walked into Nathan's office. Crane was removed from the bench, charged with corruption and abuse of judicial office, and sentenced, in the rich irony of the situation, to a substantial fine and the forfeiture of his stake in the road camp operation. The road camp itself was closed, and the men who had been serving sentences under his communal liability doctrine were released. There were 12 of them still active when the camp was shut down, and their individual cases were reviewed and found to be legally void. It was not a perfect outcome. Crane did not serve time himself, which Maria and Nathan both found insufficient, but the district attorney explained that proving intent to a criminal standard was considerably harder than the civil and administrative proceeding that had removed him from the bench, and they accepted this with the pragmatism of people who understood that justice, in the real world, is a matter of increments rather than complete satisfaction. The investigation, the removal, the closure of the camp, the release of the prisoners, these were real things. Clara Hutchins was still dead, but the mechanism that had killed her was gone. Nathan proposed marriage in the spring in the office, which was appropriate. They had become themselves in this office, had learned each other across this desk, and it was the right place for it. He did not have an elaborate speech. He was not a man given to elaborate speeches in personal matters, only in court. He said that he had never been as certain of anything as he was of wanting to spend the rest of his life in her company, and that he was aware she had not planned on any of this when she rode into Red Hollow covered in road dust with $12.40, and every intention of fighting her own injustice single-handedly. "I would have done it without you," she said. "I know," he said. "That is one of the reasons I am asking." She said yes, because of course she said yes, but she made him wait for it by exactly 3 seconds while she held his gaze and made sure he understood the full weight of what she was accepting, not rescue, not shelter, but a partnership with a man she had come to know with the thoroughness that only shared work and shared crisis and shared evening walks can produce, a man who had heard her arguments and credited them, who had called her by her first name with the particular warmth of someone who knew exactly what they were doing when they did it. They were married in Red Hollow in June of 1883 at the small church on the north side of the main street, with Dolores Vega standing as witness and Mr. Pemberton from the harness shop and Bessie Cartwright, who had made the ride from Dusty Creek and cried throughout the ceremony with the uninhibited enthusiasm that Bessie brought to all of life's significant occasions. Maria's sister, Clara, came with her husband and their children, and occupied the second pew with the efficient comfort of a woman who had been waiting for her eldest sister to have something to celebrate. Nathan's 2 sisters came from Dallas, and filled the third pew with their respective families, and the barely concealed delight of people who had watched their brother choose a wrong life before, and were genuinely relieved to see him choose a right one. The wedding was simple and warm and completely theirs, and when Nathan slid a plain gold ring onto Maria's finger and she slid one onto his, she thought about the woman who had stood on a porch in Dusty Creek, watching two deputies ride up in the early morning, and thought that the road between that porch and this church had been the strangest and most important road she had ever traveled. They moved into a house on the east side of Red Hollow, a white clapboard house with a porch that faced the morning, and a kitchen large enough to actually cook in, and a room off the back that they converted into a proper law library. With shelving, Nathan built himself over the course of a weekend, with the focused determination he brought to everything, and the results one might expect from a man whose primary skill was legal argument rather than carpentry. Requiring Maria's intervention on the third shelf before it fell down entirely, the law practice grew. Word of the Crane County case had traveled in the particular way that meaningful legal victories travel, not loudly, but persistently, passed from person to person through the networks of people who needed to know that there were lawyers who would fight. Nathan took cases that needed fighting. Maria worked beside him, managing the practice and increasingly doing preliminary legal research and first drafts that Nathan reviewed and refined, and on 2 occasions representing clients at preliminary hearings in Red Hollow's own smaller magistrate court, with Nathan watching from the gallery, with an expression that she recognized as pride wearing the disguise of professional assessment. After one of these hearings, she said to him, "You should teach me the examination techniques. I am going to need them." He looked at her with the clear gaze that he always turned on things that mattered. "Are you going to become a lawyer?" he asked. "I am going to attempt to pass the bar examination," she said. "I have been reading your books for a year. I believe I know the foundational material as well as most people who sit for it. I would need your tutoring in the courtroom procedure and the examination format." "Maria," he said, "there is not a woman in the state of Texas who has passed the Texas bar examination." "I am aware of that," she said. "There is not a law that states I cannot sit for it. There are several barriers that are a matter of tradition and practice rather than explicit statute. I have found them. I believe several can be challenged." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When would you like to begin?" That was one of the things she loved most about him, the absence of a speech about what was possible or appropriate, the movement directly to the practical question of how. She sat for the Texas bar examination in the spring of 1884, and the examiner, a fussy man from Austin who had clearly not expected to encounter a woman at his examination table, attempted twice to send her away on procedural grounds that Nathan had anticipated and prepared her for, and she answered each challenge with the precise citation of the relevant statute that confirmed her right to sit. And she did it in the tone of voice she had learned to use in Crane's courthouse, the one that was perfectly level and perfectly certain. She passed. It took the examiner 3 extra days to certify the result, which they attributed to administrative delay and did not believe for a moment. But it was certified. Nathan hung a new sign above the office door. It read, "Sheridan and Bell, Attorneys A.T. Law." Dolores Vega saw it from her hotel doorway and clapped her hands together twice and said, in Spanish and then in English, that it was about time. Their son, James Thomas Sheridan, was born in the spring of 1885. He was a loud and healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's precise dark eyes, and he arrived during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows of the white clapboard house and made the doctor's horse extremely unhappy, and Nathan spent the entire labor alternating between extreme competence and barely controlled terror, which Maria found, between contractions, genuinely endearing. When it was over and the doctor had declared everything satisfactory and left, and Nathan sat in the bedroom chair with James Thomas in his arms looking at the child with the particular stunned wonder of a person who has just encountered something that exceeds every previous framework, Maria watched them both from the bed and felt the full, complex, peaceable weight of everything she had come through to arrive at this moment. James Thomas was followed, 2 years later, by a daughter they named Clara Rose. Clara for the Hutchins woman who had not appealed. Rose for no one in particular except that the roses in the kitchen garden were blooming the week she was born, and it seemed right. Clara Rose was a smaller and more thoughtful version of her brother from the beginning, watching everything with an intensity that Nathan said was entirely her mother's and Maria said was entirely her father's, and they were both right. The practice continued to grow. Nathan and Maria took on cases that mattered: land disputes, where the small ranchers were being squeezed by the large, inheritance cases, where the law's traditional bias against women was being weaponized to deprive widows and daughters of what was rightfully theirs. Contract disputes, where the power imbalance between the parties was being used to coerce rather than negotiate. They were not the only law office in this part of Texas, but they became known as the one that would take the case when the case needed taking, when the person sitting across the desk had run out of other options, and more money than sense could absorb. Judge Harold Crane eventually settled in a small town south of San Antonio where no one knew him, living on whatever he had managed to hold onto after the investigation stripped the road camp and its profits. He was old and largely forgotten, which was, Maria thought, a sufficient justice if not a perfect one. She had occasion to think about him sometimes, not with the consuming fury of the crisis period, but with the cooler, clearer assessment of distance. A man who had built a private kingdom in a gap in the law and had believed no one would notice, or that the people who noticed would not have the means or the will to fight. He had miscalculated on both counts, and the miscalculation had cost him everything he valued. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stood in his courthouse and said, "I wish to appeal," in front of a gallery full of people who fully expected her to simply submit. She thought about that with a fondness that was different from pride, more like recognition of someone she had known very well at a particular moment in time. Red Hollow grew around them, and the years moved in the particular rhythm of a life that has found its shape, busy and purposeful and punctuated by the events that mark real time, which are mostly small and warm. Clara Rose, at 5 years old, developed a passion for the contents of the law library that manifested as her rearranging the shelves according to a system that made sense only to her, but that she defended with a ferocity that made Nathan look at Maria and say, quietly, "She is entirely you." James Thomas, at 7, was already his father's son in temperament, methodical, direct, with a core of stubbornness that he had inherited equally from both of his parents, and that would serve him as well as it had served them. He was also, in his father's specific way, quietly kind, the kind of boy who noticed when someone was struggling before anyone had said anything, and appeared with practical help before being asked. Maria watched him with Thomas Bell's name turning quietly in the back of her mind, and felt the double meaning of giving him that name as a middle name, honoring a man's warmth while not repeating his mistakes, hoping that some of the warmth had carried through the blood. Bessie Cartwright came to visit every spring, making the ride from Dusty Creek with increasing complaint about the duration as the years went on, but never failing to make it. She stayed a week each time and occupied the best guest room and ate Dollar's Vegas bread, and contributed her considerable opinions about every ongoing case in the Sheridan and Bell practice, most of which were wrong in the particulars but right in the essential moral assessment. Maria had sold the Bell property in Dusty Creek 2 years after the Crane case was resolved. She had gone back herself to arrange it, riding Juniper, who was aging but still steady, and she had walked through the house one last time in the early morning, through the kitchen and the front room, and out onto the porch where 2 deputies had come for her. She had stood on that porch and looked at the wide, flat country and thought about Thomas, About the dried flowers she had hung above the door and the tin box beneath the kitchen floorboard and the $12.40 she had carried out of this house toward a life she had not been able to predict. She had felt, standing there, a completeness that was not the same as forgetting. She missed Thomas, she would always miss Thomas, would always carry the particular grief of a person who loved someone who burned bright and burned short. But the house was not her life, and Dusty Creek was not her story, and she was ready to let the land go to someone who would actually work it. The property sold to a young couple who intended to raise cattle, which Maria thought Thomas would have found either funny or appropriate, and she rode back to Red Hollow with the proceeds in a banker's draft in her pocket and the specific lightness of someone who has set down something heavy they were carrying for someone else. By 1888, Sheridan and Bell was the most frequently recommended law practice in 3 counties. They had taken on a junior lawyer named Erasmus Park, a young man of 23 from San Antonio who had heard the story of Maria Bell's appeal through legal circles and had sought out the practice specifically because of it, which Maria found both flattering and instructive. The degree to which a single act of refusal to be overwhelmed could become, in time, a thing that drew other people toward the work it represented. One evening in the spring of 1889, when James Thomas was 4 and Clara Rose was 2, and the practice was busy, and the house smelled of the early roses, and whatever Maria had been baking since the afternoon, Nathan sat with her on the porch after the children were asleep, in the cooling night air of a Texas spring that was finally living up to its seasonal obligations after a cold and grudging winter. They sat in the way they sat, which was close and easy and entirely without performance, and the stars were out in the enormous Texas sky, and Nathan said, "I was thinking today about the day you walked into the office. You were catastrophically disorganized," Maria said. "You were covered in road dust, and you told me you had $12.40 in 29 days, and you needed to appeal a sentence you were told you had no grounds to appeal," he said. "And I thought, before I even knew anything else about you, that I had never met anyone with that particular quality of absolute refusal to accept that the situation was what other people said it was." "Stubbornness," Maria said. "No," he said. "Stubbornness is refusing to change position." This was different. This was seeing the situation more clearly than the people trying to define it for you and refusing to let their definition stand. That is not stubbornness. That is something rarer. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the evening sounds of Red Hollow horses in the livery, someone playing a guitar 2 streets over, the creek moving quietly at the edge of town. "I was very frightened," she said, "standing in that courthouse saying the words. I was more frightened than I have ever been." "You did not appear frightened," he said. "I appeared exactly as frightened as I had decided to allow myself to appear," she said, which was not at all. He put his arm around her shoulders, which was entirely easy and entirely natural after 6 years of partnership and 5 of marriage, and she leaned into it with the uncomplicated trust of someone who has learned the particular quality of another person's body in the way that only time and daily proximity can teach. "Nathan," she said, "I want to take the vicar's case." He exhaled a short breath of pure amusement. "We were having a moment," he said. "We can have the moment and I can still want to take the vicar's case," she said. "The two are not mutually exclusive." The vicar's case was a land dispute in the next county involving a widow whose property was being seized by a railroad company through eminent domain proceedings that were, in Maria's assessment, being conducted in bad faith. She had reviewed the initial documents that morning and had 3 specific legal angles that she believed would make the railroad's position significantly more expensive to maintain than they had anticipated. "Tell me the angles," Nathan said, without moving his arm, because they were people who could have a moment and a legal strategy simultaneously and had been for years. She told him. He added 2 thoughts of his own. They refined the approach together in the warm dark of the porch while the creek moved and the guitar played somewhere in the town around them. And when they had talked through all of it, The moment was still there, unchanged, the way real things remain present even when you set them aside briefly. "We will take the vicar's case," he said. "Good," she said, and she settled a little more comfortably against him and looked at the enormous Texas night, at all the stars scattered across it with the profligate abundance of things that have always been there and always will be. The spring of 1890 brought two new developments to the Sheridan and Bell household. The first was that Maria was pregnant again, which they had hoped for but not planned particularly, in the way that third children tend to arrive. The second was that the Texas Bar Association, in a proceeding that had been slowly working its way through the system for 3 years with Maria and Nathan's quiet legal contribution to it, issued new rules formally confirming the right of women to sit for and hold the bar examination in the state of Texas. Maria received the official notification on a Wednesday in April. She read it at the office desk and then carried it to where Nathan was working on the vicar's case materials and set it in front of him without comment. He read it. He looked up at her. "You helped make this," he said. "Your case made this." "We made this," she said. "Your petition tomorrow made this. The Crane County case made this." She paused. "Clara Hutchins made this in the sense that she was the person whose suffering made it necessary." He stood up and put his arms around her carefully, mindful of the slight roundness of her middle that was just becoming apparent, and she put her forehead against his shoulder for a moment in the simple physical language of two people who have been through enough together that touch has become a form of vocabulary. Their third child, a boy they named Robert Elias for Judge Morrow, who had retired the previous year, and sent a handwritten letter of congratulations when he heard about the new baby, was born in October of 1890 during a rainstorm that was significantly more cooperative than the storm that had accompanied James Thomas's arrival, though the doctor's horse remained characteristically unhappy about the weather. Robert Elias was, from the beginning, entirely his own person, loud and cheerful, and inclined to strong opinions about everything, a combination his older siblings found alternately delightful and exhausting. Nathan said, watching all three of them one Sunday afternoon in the yard behind the house, that the world did not know what it was going to have to deal with when these three were fully grown, and he said it with the particular warmth of a man who could not be prouder of the trouble they were likely to cause. The practice of Sheridan and Bell continued into the 1890s as the wild country of their youth slowly, incrementally, became something different, more settled, more connected by the spreading railroad lines, more governed by codes and courts that, while still imperfect, were less susceptible to the private kingdoms of individual men like Harold Crane. This was not a clean transition or a complete one, and the cases that came to their office were evidence enough that injustice was a persistent and inventive condition that did not require frontier lawlessness to thrive. But the specific brutality of the world Maria had navigated in 1882, the world where a judge could invent a doctrine to serve his own interests and enforce it through a sheriff he controlled, and a courthouse that had no competing authority, that world had contracted, and the contraction was real. Maria thought about this sometimes when she walked through Red Hollow, which was larger now and considerably more complicated than the town she had ridden into on juniper covering in road dust. She thought about the way things change, slowly, through accumulated small acts, through individual cases won, and arguments made and appeals filed in the face of people who believe the appeal is impossible. She thought that this was unglamorous and necessary, and that it required the specific quality Nathan had named on the porch, not stubbornness, but the refusal to let other people's definitions stand when you could see clearly that the definitions were wrong. She thought that Thomas Bell, for all his recklessness and his gambling and his terrible decisions about the male coach, had somehow set this in motion, not deliberately, not with anything like wisdom, but in the way that certain catastrophes are also certain openings, that the worst thing that happens to you can be the door through which you walk into the life you were actually supposed to be living. She had never ceased to mourn him. But she had ceased to mourn the life she would have had if he had lived and been different, because the life she had instead was hers in a way that was total and real and impossible to imagine exchanging for anything. The sign above the office door read Sheridan and Bell, attorneys A.T. Law, and it was known in 3 counties and had been referenced in 2 district court rulings and 1 state bar association publication. And it bore both their names in equal letters because that was the only arrangement that was true. James Thomas Sheridan grew into a serious and principled young man who went to Austin for law school and came back to Red Hollow with his degree and a hunger for exactly the kind of work that was waiting for him. Clara Rose Sheridan developed into exactly the woman her particular combination of intensity and stubbornness and inherited love of legal argument suggested she would become, and at 17 was reading every case file in the office with the methodical appetite of someone making a plan. Robert Elias was 13 and loud and brilliant, and had not yet decided what he was going to do with himself, which his mother told him was entirely appropriate, and his father told him would resolve itself, and which he himself had very strong opinions about that changed on a roughly weekly basis. On an evening in the autumn of 1893, 11 years after Maria Bell had walked into a law office in Red Hollow covered in road dust with $12.40, she sat on the porch of the white clapboard house with Nathan beside her, and the sounds of the children inside, and the sounds of Red Hollow around them. And she thought that she was a woman who had been given her dead husband's sentence to serve, and had instead appealed it herself and won. And that the winning had been the beginning rather than the end, and that the life between then and now had been everything a life ought to be, full of work and difficulty and love, and the particular satisfaction of doing something that matters. The creek moved at the edge of town. The stars came out one by one over the Texas dark. Nathan reached over and took her hand, which he had been doing for 11 years and which still felt in the best way like exactly what it was, the easy and certain gesture of someone who knows where he belongs. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at the sky. She thought about the courthouse in Dusty Creek and the day she had stood up and said, "I wish to appeal," and the entire chain of events that had followed from that one act of refusal. "I am thinking," she said, "that I am glad I did not submit." He squeezed her hand. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The night was warm and clear and complete around them, and everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that needed to be loved was loved, and the stars continued their ancient, reliable presence over the wide Texas sky, indifferent to human drama in the exact way that makes human drama more precious rather than less, because it is brief and specific and entirely ours, and that Maria Bell Sheridan had found is more than enough.